from the stones and began to devour the candy. One of the small ants started eating another ant, which began to call for help. Using some chopsticks, Soryang grabbed the ant and with a confident gaze revealed that this guy was the culprit. The attention of Peng Muwen and the patriarch was fixed on the ant. They were in shock since this insect was an ant and not a bee. Soryang asked them to look closely since, after all, this ant was a collateral relative of the bees. Peng Muwen began to observe the ant carefully, not knowing what Soryang was talking about. Several seconds later, the patriarch's eyes widened in fear, leaving them in shock. The little ant was furious, and upon looking closely they noticed that it had a massive stinger on its backside. They could not believe that an ant had such a large stinger. The patriarch finally realized what Soryang meant by them being collateral relatives, while on the other hand, Peng Muwen was left open-mouthed upon seeing an ant with such a large stinger. Soryang began staring at them, revealing that this creature was the collateral relative of the bee that had caused Ying Ying to collapse, a real stinger ant. Peng Muwen's gaze fixed on the ant, and he couldn't help but sweat, while on the other hand, the patriarch was in shock. This ant was the true culprit behind Ying Ying's condition, belonging to the order Hymenoptera, family Formicidae, known as the Asian needle ant. The king stinger ant or Pachycondyla chinensis was from the order Hymenoptera, from the family Formicidae, and from the subfamily Ponrani. Many must be wondering what the hell ants had to do with stingers. It was simple. These stinger ants had evolved from the same ancestor as bees, which meant that they had retained many characteristics similar to those of bees. In fact, studies on the venom of stinger ants and bees had shown that people who suffered anaphylaxis from stinger ant venom also tended to react in the same way to bee venom. Soryang grabbed the ant with the chopsticks, making it become furious, pointing at it with his finger, and with a smile, our boy mentioned that he didn't believe the ant was targeting Ying Ying specifically. According to him, it had probably appeared to feast on the demon beasts that had invaded the Tang household, revealing that the king stinger demon ant fed mainly on other demonic creatures. After being stung by the ant, one of Peng Muwen's men carefully analyzed the sting. The mark looked like a common rash, so then they had no way of knowing what had really stung her. And by the time Ying Ying regained consciousness a few days later, she simply assumed it was a residual spot from something insignificant. Peng Muwen's eyes widened in surprise and his jaw dropped. Now everything made sense, and no one would have thought that Ying Ying had collapsed because of such a pathetic and small creature. With a curious expression, he turned to the patriarch and asked if he could make an antidote. The patriarch closed his eyes and began to think. He opened his eyes, which were filled with seriousness, revealing that there was an antidote for bee venom. But cases like Ying Ying's, where the body was highly sensitive to the toxin, often it did not work effectively. Peng Muwen's eyes widened in surprise and his jaw dropped. The patriarch made it clear that just knowing the cause was a step forward, since at least now they could be careful before she collapsed again. Peng Muwen couldn't help clenching his teeth and feeling furious, but then let out a sigh. He began to observe our boy and with a smile thanked him. Soryang's eyes began to shine with joy and he nodded his head, saying that there was nothing to thank for. With a confident expression, our boy asked Peng Muwen not to worry since there was a way to treat Ying Ying, and even though it was slow, it existed. Upon hearing this, the patriarchs were in shock. Peng Muwen extended his hand and asked Soryang to tell him what it was. Soryang began touching his cheek and with a calm gaze mentioned that it was something called desensitization. Huiyen's attention fixed on our boy. She didn't know what he had in mind. Soryang began to explain himself. Peng Muwen's eyes filled with confusion and he asked if they had to undress Ying Ying again. Soryang began to sweat and with a nervous expression explained that it was a treatment where small amounts of bee venom were injected into the patient's body over time, gradually decreasing sensitivity to the toxin, so it was normal that it was going to take some time. With an angry expression, Huiyen was already ready to give Soryang a good lesson. He was sure that once the treatment was complete, Ying Ying would no longer collapse from the venom. The patriarch, with a surprised expression, crossed his arms, realizing that Soryang's method was viable, since even in the Tang clan they had similar techniques. They introduced venom gradually into the body to develop resistance. Peng Muwen clenched his fist, asking if once the treatment was over, Ying Ying would no longer collapse. With a smile, the patriarch nodded his head. It was going to take a long time, but it should be possible. Upon hearing this, a pleasant smile appeared on Peng Muwen's face. He closed his eyes and patted Soryang on the back, thanking him for having saved his daughter. Our boy started touching his head in embarrassment. The patriarch and Huiyen couldn't help but smile. Peng Muwen's eyes began to shine with joy. He grabbed our boy by the shoulders. After receiving such help, there was no way he would simply let it pass, so he asked if there was something that Soryang wanted. Whatever it was, Soryang only had to name it and he would grant it to him. Our boy started to sweat, then closed his eyes and felt somewhat confused, not knowing what was wrong with the people of this world. At the moment he helped them, they began to throw blank checks. With a grateful expression, Soryang greeted Patriarch Peng, saying that Ying Ying was his little sister, so there was no way he could expect a reward in return. Peng Muwen started laughing and gave Soryang another pat on the back, explaining that there was no such thing as modesty in the Peng clan, asking our boy to say what he wanted as a reward. The slap was so strong that Soryang began to scream in pain. He knew that if he didn't say something right now, he was going to die. Just then, our boy's eyes widened in surprise. With a joyful gaze and mouth watering, he asked if Peng Muon could join him for a mountain tour. Peng Muon became somewhat confused. The next day, Peng Muon, Soryang, Gu Pi and Huiyan went to Mount Gongga, which was in Sichuan province. Everyone's attention was fixed on the beautiful waterfall. No one had seen anything so beautiful. With a smile, Peng Muon mentioned that this was a magnificent mountain. Soryang began to laugh, explaining that it was said there was even a beautiful stone cliff. Huiyan stepped forward and her attention fixed on the waterfall. With a smile, she admitted that according to the general, this should be the place. With a confident expression, Soryang thought that she was right, since this should be the waterfall and the rock he had mentioned. Our boy felt somewhat confused since he didn't know how they were going to reach the cave that was behind the waterfall. Upon hearing this, Peng Muon turned toward them and an idea came to his mind. With a surprised gaze, he remembered that Soryang had said that he had only recently started learning mobility arts, realizing that he was not familiar with the technique of wave-stepping swallow flight. With a curious expression, our boy asked what that was. At first, Peng Muon began to smile, but then his smile disappeared and his eyes filled with confusion. He grabbed Soryang by the shirt and lifted him into the air. Explaining was painful, so he decided to teach him directly. Our boy's eyes filled with fear, causing him to start sweating, while on the other side, Huiyan put her hand over her mouth and couldn't help but go into shock. Using all his strength, Peng Muon threw Soryang toward the waterfall, and upon seeing this, Huiyan panicked. Our boy landed near the waterfall, and while he was gasping heavily, Peng Muon also landed in front of him. He put his hands on his waist and started laughing, thinking that he had a pretty agile body. Our boy fell to his knees on the ground, thinking that this guy was crazy. Huiyan also arrived at the area and with a worried expression asked if Soryang was okay. She helped Soryang sit down, and when looking forward she realized that this seemed to be the entrance of the cavern. The eyes of our boy filled with surprise since an entrance hidden behind a waterfall was mysterious. The eyes of Peng Muon began to shine with joy. He decided it was time to enter and find out what was inside the cavern. A few minutes later, while the water from the waterfall was falling into the river, Soryang and the others entered the cavern. The eyes of our boy and Huiyan widened in surprise, leaving them in shock. With a worried gaze, he admitted that something felt strange. Huiyan, who was beside him, began to observe the place and nodded her head. In front of them were small rocks, and on top there were bright crystals, surrounded by dead plants. They knew there was no way that the general had lied. The interior of the cavern was nothing like what they had expected. Soryang sat next to the crystals and began to observe them carefully. This was how Eagle, who, the general of the Miram Alliance, had described it. A ray of light falls in the center of the cavern, and the ground is covered with countless nameless flowers in full bloom. It is mysterious and strange beyond words, like another world, a paradise. Peng Muon and the others began to walk around the area. Our boy's attention was fixed on the dead plants. For him this was like hell, nothing like paradise. Huiyan, who was walking behind them, admitted that although light entered through the hole in the ceiling of the cavern, there were no blooming plants. In fact, they all seemed withered and wilted. With a serious gaze, Peng Muon realized that a sacred beast was altering the environment around it. His attention fixed on the rocks, realizing that a cold kai was radiating from the center rock. With a sincere expression, Soryang admitted that the elder was right. Peng Muon grabbed his sword and asked them to stay behind him. Slowly, Peng Muon began to walk toward the rocks. His eyes began to shine with seriousness, realizing that this was a very serious cold. Just then, a creature let out a powerful roar. Soryang's and Huiyan's eyes filled with surprise. Peng Muon's eyes began to shine with seriousness. He unsheathed his sword, revealing that the creature was ahead, asking them to stay just behind him. Soryang's eyes began to shine with joy since for him the roar had been amazing. At that moment, a creature with bright eyes began to emerge from the rocks. It began to stare at our boy and let out another roar. Our boy's eyes widened in surprise and amazement, causing his jaw to drop. The creature was a chubby-tailed gecko. The creature began to walk toward them and its body began to emit a cold kai. It was approximately 1 foot long. It had small and round yellow eyes and a chubby little tail. Soryang put his hands on his cheeks and his eyes expanded with love. The gecko was so cute that he was about to lose it. Huiyan put her hand near her mouth and with a smile admitted that the blue lizard was very beautiful. Our boy clenched his fists and couldn't help but smile, since he knew she was capable of recognizing its value. While on the other side, Peng Muon began to sweat, but then clenched his teeth as he realized something. Then the gecko began to roar. Upon seeing this, Peng Muon tightly grabbed the sword, revealing that there was another gecko deeper inside. Upon noticing there was another one, Soryang couldn't help but wonder if they were pair. Smoke began to emerge from his nose and his eyes widened in surprise when he thought that they could even have offspring out of this. He explained to Lord Peng that they had to bring them back alive no matter what. The gecko started staring at Soryong with a murderous look and cold Kai began to emerge from its body. Deeper within the rocks, there was another gecko that seemed to be injured. With a worried expression, Huiyin turned to him and asked if there was any problem. Soryong's eyes began to shine with seriousness and his attention fixed on the rocks. He had caught a faint glimmer, but he was sure of one thing. His eyes filled with concern and his gaze fixed on the gecko, revealing that he thought it might not be breathing. The other gecko opened its mouth and began to roar. Soryong decided to leave it to Commander Gupi. If something happened, he had to let him know immediately. The furious gecko was watching the entrance. Gupi, who was hiding, began to show a forced smile, asking Soryong to trust him. If the gecko showed any unusual behavior, he was going to inform Soryong immediately. Soryong left the cavern and decided to retreat for now. During the night, they lit a bonfire near the waterfall. Huiyin and Peng Muin began observing our boy who was standing near the entrance of the cavern. They knew nothing about its habits, and trying something reckless could harm the already injured creature. While the centipedes were playing with Huiyin, she adjusted her hair and with a loving expression asked our boy to come down and eat. Soryong closed his eyes and began to imagine Huiyin as his wife, preparing food for him. He couldn't help but blush since for him this was kinda sweet. Using the campfire, they started cooking the food. Peng Muin sat on the log, and with a curious expression asked if there had been any progress. Soryong, who was sitting next to Huiyin, began to ponder in silence, and then revealed that the creature hadn't moved at all. With a serious gaze, Peng Muin mentioned that when he had checked, the thing hadn't moved even a little bit. He asked if living creatures shouldn't at least be eating something. Soryong's attention was fixed on the campfire. For him it was strange, since usually geckos or common lizards fasted for several days when they were stressed. Especially fat-tailed geckos. They stored energy in their thick tails. If it hadn't eaten anything, it was likely surviving only on stored energy. They were reaching the point where a decision had to be made. With a serious expression, Soryong suggested checking on the gecko that wasn't moving. Peng Muin couldn't help but smile, thinking that they were finally going to catch the gecko. Soryong clarified that they were not going to catch it. He believed that they needed to check where it was injured, and if it got hungry, it could even eat something. He wanted Peng Muin to lure out the gecko that was watching the entrance. Upon hearing this, he couldn't help but feel somewhat surprised. Showing his bicep and a smile, Peng Muin asked if it wouldn't be easier to knock it out with a single blow. That way they would get both the healthy one and the injured one. Our boy started sweating, knowing that the gecko was going to die on the spot after being hit by those muscles. With a forced smile, our boy explained that if Peng Muin smacked it, even the rock thing that repelled General Jekyll, whose men could drop dead on the spot. Lord Peng started laughing, thinking that our boy was right. He gave Soryong a strong slap on the back, mentioning that it was no wonder that a scholar like him, always glued to his desk, had been relegated by a phenomenon like that rock thing. He thought that if he hit the gecko, he could kill it. With a serious gaze, Peng Muin asked if the plan was to subdue the gecko gently. Showing one finger, Soryong said that was the best move. With the help of a stick, Soryong began to draw on the ground, explaining that first, Peng Muin was going to lure out the lively gecko, then he and Huiyin were going to check on the one that seemed to be injured during that time. Huiyin threw some rocks on the ground, explaining that in the meantime, the poison division could block the path to Soryong. The Lord nodded his head, thinking that this seemed to be the best approach. With a smile, Peng Muin asked if there was anything else he should watch out for. Our boy asked him just to make sure it didn't reach the wall, since it could climb it and come over to his side. Peng Muin hit his fist on his chest, and his eyes began to shine with enthusiasm. He decided to move since his body was eager for action. He started running toward the cavern. Soryong panicked and asked him to please go slowly. A smile appeared on Huiyin and Soryong's face. Our boy knew that if the gecko was sick, then it might not have much time left. Peng Muin, who had the sword resting on his shoulder, Soryong and the others entered the cavern. Upon noticing that they had returned, the gecko's eyes began to shine with rage. Soryong brought his hand to his mouth and whispering gave Peng Muin that he could begin. Upon hearing this, an excited smile appeared on his face. Peng Muin drew his sword and while his eyes were shining, began to imbue mana in it. He and his men drew their weapons and began to advance toward the rocks. Upon seeing that they were planning to attack, the gecko's eyes began to shine with rage and it let out a loud roar. It jumped and using all its strength, attacked, but luckily Peng Muin reacted in time and blocked the attack using his sword. The gecko struck hard at the sword using its tail. He couldn't help but smile as he couldn't believe that such a small creature was good enough to be a first-rate warrior of the Peng family. The creature backed away, only to gather momentum and attack again. Upon seeing this, an excited smile appeared on Peng Muin's face and his eyes began to shine. Using the sword, he deflected the trajectory of the gecko's attack, and when it realized it, it couldn't help but feel somewhat confused. With a serious gaze, Peng Muin told his men that this was their chance. In the blink of an eye, Peng Muin's men surrounded the small creature. It got angry and started roaring. Soryang's eyes filled with fear, but Huiyin grabbed him by the shoulders and whispering suggested moving quickly while they could. A while later, they moved away from the area and reached the rocks. Soryang's eyes widened in surprise. With a worried gaze, Huiyin asked if the creature was really injured. He replied that it seemed so. Upon observing closely, he noticed that the tip of the tail was necrotized due to an incomplete shedding. It had not been able to finish shedding, and now its eyes were also full of pus. With a curious expression, Huiyin asked what to do now. Resting his hand on the rock, Soryang explained that they should treat the gecko immediately, but there was no medicine or anything here. With a confident smile, he decided to strip it all off. Upon hearing this, Huiyin couldn't help but feel somewhat confused. With a furious gaze, she mentioned that lately, it seemed like he wanted to strip everything. Soryang started blushing like a tomato, but he knew this was the right method. Our boy took a step and the injured gecko woke up. He began to extend his hand toward it, explaining that he was going to treat it, asking it to stay still. The gecko closed its eyes. Soryang grabbed the creature and his eyes widened in surprise. Just like the queen bee, it seemed to understand speech to some extent. Soryang grabbed the gecko's skin, mentioning that these creatures, like snakes, shed their skin. However, wild fat-tailed geckos often ate their own shed skin, so it was difficult to find any remains. Huiyin's eyes widened in amazement. He left the gecko on top of the rock and took out his kunai, realizing that this skin was very tough, and doing this with bare hands wasn't going to work. With the help of the kunai, he got to work. Huiyin's eyes filled with surprise since according to her, it looked just like a precious stone. Using the kunai, Soryang cut a bit of the gecko's shed skin, revealing a beautiful and shiny color. Gently, Soryang removed the skin from the gecko's leg. Pointing at it with her finger, Huiyin couldn't help but feel tenderness since it looked like gloves. He knew she couldn't resist it because even during his days as a YouTuber, videos of peeling off shed skin went viral. Now the only parts left were the head and the tail. Soryang acted carefully since one had to be cautious around the eyes so as not to hurt the creature. There was pus accumulated in the gecko's eyes. It was because it had not been able to shed completely. Now the inflammation had filled its eyes. Very carefully and gently, Soryang managed to remove the skin from the gecko's head without hurting it. With a smile, our boy asked if it felt better. The gecko's body began to tremble until it opened its eyes. Huiyin couldn't help but feel somewhat excited. Soryang began to observe the gecko closely. Huiyin asked if there was any problem. With a sincere gaze, he admitted that yes. Pointing at the gecko's tail, he mentioned that he was debating what to do with its tail. He began to sweat since he knew that to stop the necrosis, he would have to cut off the tail. But in its current state, cutting it could kill it instead. Just then, Peng Muin began to shout, asking Soryang to be careful. Upon hearing this, he and Huiyin went on alert. Peng Muin revealed that they had lost the gecko. Just then, the gecko appeared behind them. The creature's eyes began to shine with hatred. Upon noticing this, our boy panicked and asked it to calm down. Showing the kunai and holding the gecko in his arms, Soryang explained that he was only trying to help and treat its friend. Our boy's attention was fixed on the kunai and his eyes filled with surprise and confusion. Upon seeing the weapon, the gecko exploded with rage and began to roar.
So that the videos come out more often, show your activity by subscribing to the channel and your royal like. Do it now. The more subscriptions, the more videos will be released and they will be much longer. Let's hit our first 10,000 subscribers.